Good afternoon. Your MC for the portion of this part of the conference is Myron E. Bell. He's Director of Energy and Global Warming Policy at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. He chairs the Cooler Heads Coalition, representing more than 24 nonprofit groups in the United States and abroad that question global warming alarmism and oppose energy rationing. Myron has testified before 6 congressional committees and lives to tell about it. And he's debated scores of government officials and alarmists on radio, TV, in person, and pretty near any place you can see 2 of them grouped together. He's been censured, criticized, and demonized by a variety of groups, including Greenpeace, Rolling Stone, 7 members of the British House of Commons, and the Clean Air Trust, which named him Villain of the Month. And here he is, Myron E. Bell.
Thank you. I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm very honored to be able to introduce Jack Schmitt and Art Robinson. Before I do that, I should say I asked both of them, well, what do you want me to say about you? And Art said, just say that our next speaker is Art Robinson. And Jack Schmitt said, oh, well, the less the better. So let me take 1 minute to say, that yes, it's my privilege to chair something called the Cooler Heads Coalition, and Heartland Institute is a very valued member of it. And I would like to say there's something very special about working with Heartland. They don't see other nonprofit groups as rivals, they see them as allies, and they always work in the most cooperative fashion. They are exemplary. And I would like to especially thank Joe Bast and James Taylor and the whole Heartland team for putting this conference on, and I hope you'll join me in thanking them. In terms of the global warming debate, I just have one message, and I should say that you can find the message of the Cooler Heads Coalition at our website, globalwarming.org, where you can also sign up for our weekly email newsletter mostly on the politics of global warming and energy rationing, called the Cooler Heads Digest, and you can sign up at globalwarming.org. But my message on global warming is really just this. I grew up and came to maturity during the tail end of the counterculture, and I learned to question authority. And what I'd like to say, I think that's what we're all doing here. We're questioning authority. That's what Dick Lindzen spoke about so cogently last night. And I would just like to say, here's what you need to do. Question Al Gore's authority. Question Al Gore's authority. Now, I'm first going to introduce Harrison Jack Schmitt. He was trained as a geologist. He has a PhD in geology. I noticed that in Grist magazine, in trying to trash this conference and the speakers at it, mentioned that he was not qualified. After all, he was just an astronaut who'd been to the moon. Well, in terms of the fact that we're always accused of being flat earthers, at least there's one of us here who can proudly say he knows that the Earth isn't flat. He's been to the moon and he's seen it. He was the last man, one of the last 2 men to walk on the moon. We hope there will be some more in the next few years. We hope that they will be Americans. And since leaving NASA and retiring as an astronaut, Jack was elected to the U.S. Senate from New Mexico in 1976. He had a very fine career. I remember it. I have many in-laws in Albuquerque who worked on his campaign. Unfortunately, he came up for re-election in the catastrophic year for Republicans of 1982. And so he retired from the Senate after that election. And since then, he's been involved in a number of ventures, both academic and entrepreneurial. I think we're very lucky to have Jack Schmitt here today, and I would ask you to join me in welcoming him.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I want to thank Myron for his introduction and thank all of you for being here and helping the Heartland Institute and its leaders and its staff to put on such an outstanding and important meeting. Swimming against the tide, particularly a political tide, as I have found, is never easy, but tides do reverse. My father, Harrison A. Schmitt, also a geologist, economic geologist as a matter of fact, introduced me to climate science at the early age of 8. He had a strong interest in the subject, and in 1973 enlisted my mother, Ethel Hagen, and me in the measurement of rainfall in our new home outside Silver City, New Mexico, southwestern New Mexico. He had recognized in his readings, the obvious correlation of precipitation in the Southwest and the 11-year solar sunspot cycle. Not only did the well-known several thousand-year record in tree rings correlate in this way, but the local rainfall from 1876, recorded at the old cavalry base, Fort Baird, gave a clear contemporary correlation as well as a hint, believe it or not, of the 80-year Gleisberg cycle. I continued this family interest in weather and in climate during the first 3 days of my Apollo 17 mission to the moon by observing and forecasting weather across the Earth's southern hemisphere, visible to us in great detail. Private studies of research papers on climate and solar correlations have continued to this day. I do not claim to be an independent researcher, but as in my lunar activities, I am a synthesizer of what others do well. As a consequence, several indisputable facts appear evident in geological and climate science that make me a true, quote, denier, unquote, of human-caused global warming. The conclusion seems inescapable that nature produces the primary influences on climate. Draconian tax and regulatory proposals for taxpayers and the economy to fund government action to fight with this so-called specter should scare anyone who believes in liberty as well as rational science. The economic and governance consequences of those ineffective reactions to what nature dictates is going to happen clearly will be more detrimental to America and to the world than just addressing the specific consequences of natural climate variations. Contrary to categorical statements by many politicians and unfortunately some scientists, including some colleagues of mine, the science of climate change and its causes is not settled, at least not to this geologist. Climate certainly will change, one way or another, no matter what humans do, and it has done so throughout Earth's history. Just in historical times, the medieval warm period of 800 to 1300 and its decade-by-decade transition into over about a century into the Little Ice Age of 1400 to maybe 1900 actually, confirm that major climate changes over decades and centuries are not new. Analyses show that measurement of trends in Earth's surface temperature continue to be difficult, but not impossible. For example, balloon-measured temperatures and satellite microwave sounding data do not show recent temperature increases in the upper atmosphere corresponding to those alleged for the lower atmosphere. Specifically, the predicted tropospheric hotspot just isn't there. Land-based and sea temperature measurements increasingly are subject to revision or reanalysis. Nonetheless, careful synthesis by many of you of measured temperatures and of various scientifically credible surrogates for temperature show a trend of about half a degree warming per 100 years since about 1660 or thereabouts. That is, since the final depths of the Little Ice Age. Its dismissal of this fact on its face suggests that the IPCC has agendas other than science. Surprise, surprise. Direct, continuous measurements of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere over the last 50 years show a steady increase, but the measurement itself does not indicate the source of the increase. Of course, the IPCC alleges that the increase results from increased fossil fuel burning. However, the slowly increasing temperatures since 1660 or so also would release more carbon dioxide and indeed methane from land-confined water, the biosphere, and of course, mostly the oceans. So as a matter of established physics of gases, we expect carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to increase as temperature increases. As the rise in average temperature of the much more massive oceans will lag the rise in average atmospheric temperature, a comparable lag in increase in atmospheric carbon dioxide would be expected. Indeed, some ice core data indicates that this lag for major carbon dioxide increases may be several centuries. The lag for smaller changes appears to be about 3 months. And we are seeing increasingly that different lags depend on the different causes for changes in ocean temperatures. Another fact, by at least a factor of 20, water vapor and water makes up by far the most important atmospheric greenhouse gas, with carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide being relatively small players. Although seldom mentioned in articles stating the dire consequences of increased carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we have little quantitative knowledge of the atmosphere water cycle or of cycles in water's variability as a contributor to climate change or climate stability. We just know it happens. Further, due to the limits of physics, carbon dioxide cannot absorb unlimited amounts of heat, no matter its concentration increases in the atmosphere. In fact, carbon dioxide approaches its absorption limit at about its current concentration. The capacity for carbon dioxide to absorb heat is greatest at low concentrations and lowest at high concentrations. And we have already seen most of the possible greenhouse effect of modern carbon dioxide levels. An enormous amount of data and analysis has confirmed that carbon dioxide cannot accumulate in the Earth's prevailing atmosphere at levels and rates claimed by the IPCC and its supporters. As a matter of established fact, the residence time of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is only 5 and at the most, in some cases, 10 years. Not the 50 to 200 years claimed by the IPCC and, again, its supporters. In addition, the oceans, as a primary sink for carbon dioxide, hold 50 times the amount present in the atmosphere at any given time. The 1 to 50 concentration relationship between these two reservoirs realistically limits the absolute amount of radiative forcing by carbon dioxide that can occur. And other carbon sinks reinforce this limit. For new carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, climatic changes induced by new releases of carbon dioxide are superimposed on long-term trends to about a decadal time scale, roughly what various records show. These facts and the systematics of atmospheric carbon dioxide and rapid climate changes in the historic past make it impossible, at least for me, to accept the recent claim by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's panel that climate change due to increases in carbon dioxide concentrations is largely irreversible for 1,000 years after emissions stop. There exists no historical or scientific basis of which I am aware for such a statement. Where do we find such people? Care must also be taken in the interpretation of the carbon dioxide, quote, record, unquote, in Greenland and Antarctic ice cores, not all, but some, due to uncertainties in the mechanics of the gas preservation, either caused by nature or caused by human intervention. In some cases, the trapped atmosphere in the ice caps may not be part of a closed system, particularly when the ice system has had liquid water present or has been systematically deformed or is a subject to cracking upon release of pressure. Not surprisingly, Considering the science of ice, carbon dioxide concentrations in the trapped gases of many cores older than about 300 years hold remarkably constant over the last 7,000 to 8,000 years. This constancy is incompatible with other data indicating significant variation during that period. On the other hand, the analyses of the Iccc Dome Sea and Vostok Antarctic cores, just recently reanalyzed, show possible variations and a strong correlation between carbon dioxide and methane concentrations and isotopic temperature determinations back to about 800,000 years. The 500-year time resolution of these correlations, however, remain insufficient to determine if carbon dioxide and methane changes lead or lag temperature changes. We know from other evidence that indeed the lag is there. Observational and geological records, the seasons, and our ability to predict weather and periodic climate changes based on known Earth and solar cycles document that energy from the sun drives changes in weather, climate, and longer-term thermal variations. Abundant geological and climate information shows that the position and orientation of the Earth in its orbit around the sun determines climate and weather. Many deniers of nature's modern control of climate admit this fact, as you have probably seen in some of their papers. But because no one has yet determined a clear amplification mechanism or mechanisms, they then dismiss their own conclusion. And that is weird. For example, the 11-year sunspot cycle that my father pointed out to me so many years ago, observed over many centuries by astronomers, as well as being strongly reflected in tree rings, stalagmite layers, and other prehistoric and geological records. Much research now documents that the solar sunspot cycle also correlates with variations in stratospheric winds and cosmic ray flux in the atmosphere. Indeed, the 1400 to 1900 Little Ice Age corresponds to a cyclic sequence of 3 deep minima in sunspot activity, including being the coldest during the last of these minima, a 70-year period of exceptionally few sunspots we now know as the Madra minimum. Seasons vary, of course, because of the changing solar energy input in annual response to the orientation of the Earth's hemispheres relative to the Earth's 23-degree inclination to the rays of the sun. Also, longer-term periodic variations of 14,000 and 100,000 years in the Earth's obliquity and orbit eccentricity, respectively, that change the average millennial absorption of solar energy, apparently cause entry into and recovery from major ice ages. Although what necessary feedback mechanisms relate to such great climate changes remain to be quantified. That is probably the greatest challenge we have scientifically ahead of us right now, is to figure out how in the world the sun accomplishes these massive changes. The more transient effects of volcanic eruptions and the solar shielding effects of their atmospheric ash and sulfur dioxide also demonstrate in reverse the tie between solar flux and at least short-term climate swings. No definitive evidence therefore exists in support of the hypothesis that the Industrial Revolution has driven carbon dioxide levels up more rapidly than otherwise expected for a response to long-term temperature increases. No evidence likewise exists against the conclusion that variations in solar heating remain the overwhelming dominant driver of climate change and weather. Intriguingly, indications continue to grow that cosmic ray flux influences the formation of low clouds and that this flux varies with the intensity of the sun's magnetic field. Solar sunspot cycles and variations in those cycles, of course, constitute the major control of solar magnetic intensity. Now, attempts at complex systems modeling play a major role in the IPCC conclusions. In fact, modelers that base their predictions of catastrophic global warming, now called, if you've noticed, what-if scenarios rather than predictions, cannot hope to predict the future of such an exceedingly complex natural system as Earth's climate. Claims that these models represent the use of physics to produce predictions intentionally mislead. Continually modified observational estimates of the impact of various climate and economic variables on each other in 250 kilometer square and 1 kilometer high cells feed the complex mathematical assumptions of these models. Much subjective windage and amplifiers must be added to make details of the models comport somewhat with observational reality. But we can't ignore, I believe, any illusion that this involves physics rather than complicated guessing. This process makes models extraordinarily complex, but at the same time, overly simplistic, in that they leave out or average the effects of many important factors, such as clouds and thunderstorms, for example. Even replicating documented climate change in the recent past has proven beyond their capability, much less the prediction of major known climate events in the distant past. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we now are faced with proposals for cap, trade, and tax regulations on carbon dioxide emissions, now proposed by many in power, which constitute an enormous transfer of wealth and liberty from the people to the government. Minimum U.S. government estimates of the current version of this tax start with over $60 billion a year, with the Congressional Budget Office, never known for overestimating tax revenues, saying the number may be more like $300 billion a year, nearly $1 trillion every 3 years, and if you believe those numbers, I've got you some bridges to sell. This tax does not include the higher cost of energy for everyone. With such a transfer of wealth to government, history shows that stagnated or reduced economic activity assuredly follows. To maintain and increase our standard of living and that of the rest of the world requires continued and increased use of fossil and nuclear fuels until truly economically competitive energy alternatives exist. Until such energy alternatives appear decades hence, as I'm sure they could, fossil and nuclear fusion fuels remain our aces in the hole, the driving force of freedom, necessary to maintain the American economy, the American dream, and American security. The consequences to liberty of not continuing to grow our economy and living standards would rival the threat now in place from the current politically driven financial crisis. Globally, as we heard this morning from Larry Solomon, the resources spent on fighting climate change rather than relatively low-cost preparation for its adverse as well as beneficial consequences compete with private and national expenditures to fight real and current problems of ignorance, famine, disease, and low living standards. Foremost among the adverse consequences of misguided anti-global warming policies, we find a lack of growth in worldwide supplies of energy, the only moral driver of increases in living standards and lower birth rates. We see inflation in food prices, pushed up by the use of food crops to create grossly non-competitive biofuels. We see net energy costs rise in response to the siren songs of solar energy, or a hydrogen economy based on cracking natural gas. Acting on consensus and unfounded fear-mongering to increase the size, intrusiveness, and cost of government constitutes the last thing we should do to deal with climate change. Instead, we must insist that our leaders objectively and selfishly consider the facts available, or, as was suggested also at breakfast, get new leaders. What should we do while waiting for the inevitable collapse of human-caused climate change hysteria? Well, we must prepare to adapt to inevitable climate change. however unpredictable it may seem to some. We can recognize that production of our own domestic oil and gas, coal, and nuclear resources buys us time to work these challenges and to preserve our liberty as well as our national security. We can develop far better surface and space observational techniques and use them consistently over decades to better understand our Earth. We can quit being so damn reactive on political timescales to things we don't understand. We can choose sustained research and development of potential energy alternatives, those with clear paths to commercialization, rather than continue subsidies for premature introduction of flawed concepts. We can provide investor and development-friendly business environments for the maturation of competitive new sources of energy. Indeed, instead of being dumb or politically greedy, we can start being wise and truly concerned about the society in which our children and their children will live. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.